Hello to everyone out there watching today's video. My name is Dior, and today we're going to be talking about the 20th century American Italian Mafia and its relation to Nicolo Machiavelli's The Prince. We are going to look into the rise and height of the American Italian Mafia, which occurred in the early 20th century. To understand this American version of the Mafia, we must first look at where it was derived from, the established Sicilian Mafia. The Sicilian Mafia came about as a result of the numerous foreign powers that shuffled control of Italy between different political heads throughout the country's history. Specifically, in the 19th century, when Italian feudalism and aristocracy fell away due to the unification of Italy, which began in 1848. During this change, there were no civil organizations and no properly functioning state, and the Mafia emerged as a result of the people of the Sicilian island coming together and creating groups to give themselves protection, as well as carrying out justice and retribution. These groups eventually became known as the families or the clans. The newly formed central government asked for the Sicilian Mafia's assistance, and according to Catanzaro, the Mafia partly competed with state protection, partly conspired with it, and partly became its armored extension. This involvement of the Sicilian Mafia with the government, and also Catholic Church, introduced it to new influences, political, economical, and social. The Sicilian Mafia remained unchallenged until Benito Mussolini and fascism went on the rise in the early 20th century. With the fascist government attempting to monopolize protection, Mafia members were in danger, and many fled to the Americas, specifically, in regards to this video, to cities in the United States. In the States, the Prohibition era had just begun in January of 1920, and immigrants, including Sicilian Italians, found themselves in cramped living quarters and working in hard labor sweatshops with low pay. Prior to this era, small gang activity was common, but with the nationwide ban of alcohol, living conditions that left many wanting more, the rise of experienced Sicilian Mafia Italians, along with immigrant discrimination, these all became factors in a formula resulting in the mass formation of criminal activity known as organized crime. For those already familiar with Nicolo Machiavelli's The Prince, the brief description of the Sicilian Mafia already shows signs of principles highlighted in the book. In a short summary, The Prince is a guide for princes, specifically Lorenzo de' Medici, but more so a treatise on power, its acquisition and preservation. This following section will bring together the similarities between the points made in The Prince and the American Italian Mafia's rise and peak of power. Note that chapters 2, 8, 17, 18, 19, and 22 will be discussed in the second half of the video. In Chapter 3 of The Prince, Machiavelli informs the reader that when the country and language are the same, it is easier to hold them, especially when they have not been accustomed to self-government, because the two peoples preserving in other things the old conditions and not being unlike in customs will quietly live together. Of the small street gangs of the time before the Prohibition, some prominent ones arose from poor Italian American working class communities. They began bootlegging the alcohol themselves, providing communities with illegal drinks. This underground business boomed, and these small gangs realized that working together allowed for more profit. These gangs took what they knew from back home in Sicily and adapted it to what we may call American standards, creating a hierarchical structure for the families. According to an interview with journalist Howard Bloom, ex-member of the Colombo family Salvatore Sammy the Bull Gravano explained the membership rules. Where once membership was strictly Sicilian, over the years it was extended to anyone who was born of Italian parents. Later it was reduced to just having a father of Italian birth. This organization was known as La Cosa Nostra, which translates to Our Thing, informed Tommaso Buscetta, one of the first Mafia members to break his vow of silence and become an informant. He described how there isn't an application. Non-members are invited to join the family by those already in it. By keeping the family and all its members strictly relating to Italian origins, there is a sense of unity that strengthens the bonds between members. This is our thing. It is our culture, our language. These are our struggles, and if we invite you, this is our family. It is also interesting to point out how these clans are named families. It allows for those on top to say, "We are the same. We are family. Just do as I say, and I will take care of you." For poor Italian immigrants, this is a lucrative invitation. In Chapter 4, Machiavelli writes, "By a prince with a body of servants, who assist him to govern the kingdom, administers by his favor and permission. Those states that are governed by a prince and his servants hold their prince in more consideration, because in all the country there is no one who is recognized as superior to him. And if they yield obedience to another, they do it as a minister and official, and they do not bear him any particular affection. And the difficulties which others have had to keep in acquisition are by the want of uniformity in the subject state." In relation to the Mafia, these servants are the lower members of the family. These include associates that are non-members but still work for the family. Associates are recommended to be soldiers or made men who are inducted into the family. This induction includes the pricking of the finger to draw blood, which is then spilled on a card depicting a saint. This is being done while the oath of loyalty, or the ermetta, is being spoken in Italian. These soldiers are the ones who dirty their hands the most. The capo regime, or capo, is next up, and they are the ones in charge of the soldiers. They report to the underboss or the boss. Next up is the underboss, seen as the second in command. The right-hand man to the boss is called the consigliere, and they also act as the advisor and representative for the family. At the very top is the boss, the head of the family. They are referred to as the Don, or Godfather. The lower members of the family are loyal only to the boss. This structure is what coined the term organized crime. It brought uniformity to the underworld in a way that was never seen before. Additionally, their vow of loyalty, the ormetta, was basically a code of silence that the members lived by. Such a vow made it extremely difficult for law enforcement to even attempt to take down the family. This gave them even more power to the boss. Chapter 5 states that, but in republics there is more vitality, greater hatred, and more desire for vengeance, which will never permit them to allow the memory of their former liberty to rest, so that the safest way is to destroy them or to reside there. Though Machiavelli is speaking of republics, the resulting choices of action are the same, and according to Mafia history, it can be clear that many Mafia bosses thought the first choice was best to defend their territory. One of the bloodiest examples was the St. Valentine's Day Massacre in 1929. Scarface Al Capone was in a bitter rivalry with Bugs Morgan, the only other prominent gang leader in Chicago. In order to eliminate his threat, Capone sent his men disguised as police officers to Morgan's headquarters. Once inside, they lined up the 7 men, important servants of Morgan's, and killed them all. Though Morgan himself had evaded death by seeing what he thought were real officers enter his establishment and waiting outside. Regardless of the fact that Morgan himself survived, he had no means of vengeance against the new, now sole ruler of Chicago, and thus Capone succeeded in destroying any threats. Chapter 6 states, and it ought to be remembered, that there is nothing more difficult to take in hand, more perilous to conduct, or more uncertain in its success, than to take the lead in the introduction of a new order of things, because the innovator has for enemies all those who have done well under the old conditions, and lukewarm defenders in those who may do well under the new. And in talking about those princes who took upon principalities with much difficulty at first, due to them having to rewrite the governing state, yet succeeding by force, they will begin to be respected, and they will continue afterwards powerful, secure, honored, and happy. Machiavelli in The Prince here gives examples of Moses, Cyrus, Theseus, and Romulus, prophets who were armed and succeeded in using force to establish a new order. Machiavelli is talking about how difficult it is to rewrite the rules when taking over an already established order, because those who succeeded in the old order don't want change, and those who think they may do well know that the future success is always questionable. For the Mafia, Charles Lucky Louisiano was the one who turned the several scattered street gangs into a functioning, organized, hierarchical crime system. At first, he was under Joe the Boss Masseria, who declared himself boss of all bosses. After having Joe assassinated, along with his successor Salvatore Maranzano, Lucky joined the Italian and Jewish gangs together, and additionally established the Commission, also known as the Five Families, in New York. He also connected the families in Chicago and Buffalo. His use of force brought upon a new order and established the Italian Mafia as a powerful underground organization. In Chapter 7, it states that those who solely by good fortune become princes from being private citizens have little trouble in rising, but much in keeping atop. They have not any difficulties on the way up, because they fly, but they have many when they reach the summit. Such are those to whom some state is given, either for money or by the favor of him who bestows it. Less of a direct example would be the previously stated Joe the Boss Masseria. He was the head of one of the multiple groups that bitterly fought for control of what would then end up being the Genovese crime family. Unlike the other group heads, Masseria had the backing of Salvatore de Aquila, who was regarded as the senior advisor for all mafia families. Additionally, in an unexpected assassination attempt, Masseria managed to avoid being shot and was found with bullet holes in his straw hat. He was then nicknamed the man who could dodge bullets. Yet though he was able to overcome these instances, he did not remain head of the newly formed Genovese family for long. His underboss, Lucky, had him and his second-in-command killed so that he would become head of the family. It cannot be said that Masseria only had good fortune on his side. He had his fair share of struggles that additionally helped his becoming the head of the family. However, it does reiterate the idea that those who come to power on their own abilities are more successful and accepted than those who had had more external support. Chapter 9 informs us that, therefore, to make this point clear, I say that the nobles ought to be looked at mainly in two ways. That is to say, they either shape their course in such a way that binds them entirely to your fortune, or they do not. In this case, an example of the Gambino crime family will again be used. Explicitly, the secession of power from Carlo Gambino. Gambino had averted expectations in his choosing of Paul Cassiano. Cassiano was more of a businessman, and through the eyes of the other members of the family, had not earned the street credit as the other members. Thus the family was split into two. Half bound themselves to the fortune of Cassiano, and the other half did not, and simply went through the motions. Among those that did not were John Gotti, who eventually coordinated the assassination of Cassiano and took over as head of the family. This assassination was influential because it was the first since the attempted murder of Frank Costello in 1957 that did not have the permission of the other five families. It is difficult to maintain power when one is placed there by fellow nobles. If they disagree with your methods and actions, they will not hesitate in finding a replacement. Chapter 14 states that it is not reasonable that he who is armed should yield obedience willingly to him who is unarmed, or that the unarmed man should be secure among armed servants. And a wise prince ought to never in peaceful times stand idle, but increase his resources with industry, in such a way that they may be available to him in adversity, so that if fortune chances it, may find him prepared to resist her blows. For the Mafia, idle times seem few and far between. If the bootlegging, prostitution, gambling, bribing, loan sharking, and towards the mid to late 20th century, narcotics and drug trafficking weren't enough, rivalries kept tensions high. Additionally, the supply of arms were plentiful in the Mafia, and some individual members made certain firearms infamous. According to the Smithsonian Magazine, all of the top 6 most well-known mob murders involved guns of some sort. Additionally, from Michael Franzese, an ex-capo regime of the Colombo crime family, tells of life inside the Mafia. He explains that for many in the lower levels of the family, if there is a call, they are required to drop everything to answer. To do otherwise is to sign your death sentence. In the lifestyle of the Mafia, adversity is expected in every corner, and based on past records, supposedly must be met with a gun. In Chapter 15, it says that, I know that everyone will confess that it would be most praiseworthy in a prince to exhibit all the above qualities that are considered good. But because they can neither be entirely possessed nor observed, for the human conditions do not permit it, it is necessary for him to be sufficiently prudent, in that he may know how to avoid the reproach of those vices which would lose him his state. The Mafia uses virtuous qualities to pose as the reasons why what they do is justified. For example, they use Catholic influences in their inductions and hold a strict moral code in which breaking it means certain death. The first can be seen in the Catholic altar cards that are marked with the inductee's blood and lit on fire. The second is in the idea of rebirth into a family, said during the oath. Michael Franzese explains how, they said, this is the oath. Tonight, Michael Franzese, you are born again into a new life, into La Cosa Nostra. Betray your brothers, betray your oath, and you will die and burn in hell like the saint is burning in your hand. Do you accept? And I said yes. In the interview, he goes on to explain that the most attractive part of the Mafia wasn't the money, but the idea of a bonded brotherhood, men taking care of each other. Additionally, inductees are told that they will always have the support of the family, that their mothers, sisters, and daughters will be protected. Additionally, through the Mafia, there were many opportunities for networking, for meeting new people and building connections. These are all fronts that people may see as virtuous, not realizing that this is in fact a criminal organization responsible for the multitudes of tragic deaths each year. Chapter 21 states that further, he ought to entertain the people with festivals and spectacles at convenient seasons of the year, and that every city is divided into guilds, or into societies. The Mafia wasn't just about gang territories and political, economical, and police control. To be able to bring in the kind of money to be able to hold such power, they needed to run operations. At the start of it all, with alcohol production and distribution. Since Prohibition was unpopular with many Americans, these operations were seen as the brave, tough people able to stand up against the government. Once the Prohibition was over, these gangs still continued to provide the services the people wanted. As mentioned before, these include prostitution, gambling, bribing, loan sharking, narcotics, and drug trafficking. These, though considered immoral by some, definitely provided the entertainment that others wanted. Additionally, many rumors about the Mafia's good contributions became legend. One such example is the one in which a relation close to Al Capone became sick after unknowingly drinking spoiled milk, and in consequence, Al Capone enforced the use of expiration labels on all bottles of milk. In providing pleasurable services and in the spreading of positive rumors of the Mafia, they attempted to keep the people happy, or at least compel them to dismiss their less agreeable actions. In Chapter 22, the choice of servants is of no little importance to a prince, and they are good or not according to the discrimination of the prince. And the first opinion which one forms of a prince, and of his understanding, is by observing the men he has around him. In the Mafia, it seems as if special importance is placed on three things, the first being the place of birth of yourself and or of your parents. Those of Sicilian background are seen in higher regard than those born in the States from immigrant parents from a different Italian city. Such is the reason Joe the Boss Masseria chose Lucky to be his underboss. The second seems to be your cleverness and ruthlessness and overall effectiveness in completing the task set before you. The third seems to be your loyalty. Those who keep the oath are respected, even if they are from rival families. The higher levels of the family seem to be made up of these types of people, or at least they attempt to surround themselves with them. These were the traits valued in the Mafia, and so to surround yourself with men who express them, these higher level members were able to build infamous reputations. In Machiavelli's The Prince, he poses a question for the reader, whether it be better to be loved than feared, or feared than loved. And immediately following, he gives his answer. Machiavelli says that though the ideal situation would be to be both feared and loved, if one must be above the other, then to be feared is better than being loved. Through fear, people will do what you say, because they will wish to avoid punishment. If the relationship is through love, then that means there must be a complete trust between the prince and the people underneath him. If a ruler is beloved by those under him, then his actions will be seen as wondrous and beneficial. The people will not question a prince they adore. This is why Machiavelli does not completely dismiss a ruler being loved. However, as stated in the book, Machiavelli would rather concern himself with the real world, and in that world men are selfish and evil. A prince should work on the adoration of the people, yet always expect someone to work against him. Since the prince will not always know from who this counteraction will occur from, he must have a distrust towards everyone. He cannot solely rely on devotion, so the safest option is to use fear. In the world regarding the Italian American Mafia, the acquisition of power is usually done through violence and by force. As such, there will always be resentment from someone in the community. The devotion can perhaps be held in the ormetta and in the feeling of brotherly camaraderie between the members. But other than that, fear is the most prominent weapon used by the Mafia. In Chapter 2, Machiavelli explains how there are fewer difficulties in holding hereditary states, and those long accustomed to the family of their prince, than new ones. It is reasonable to expect that his subjects will be naturally well disposed towards him. Such is true especially in Sicilian immigrants. They were previously used to living under the Sicilian Mafia, who also weaponized fear. They didn't expect help from the Italian government to do anything about it, and they certainly didn't expect the government in the States to do anything either. It was something they had to deal with, their own thing, la cosa nostra. In Chapter 8, the application of Machiavelli directly relates to the Mafia. Here he explains why princes who commit criminal acts cannot be called talent to slay fellow citizens, to deceive friends, to be without faith, without mercy, without religion. Such methods may gain empire, but not glory. He goes on to say that a prince with barbarous cruelty and inhumanity with infinite wickedness does not permit him to be celebrated among the most excellent men. What he achieved cannot be attributed either to fortune or genius. This is in regards to the people's perception of the prince. Even so, in regards to the mafia, there is a mixed feeling towards it. Surely there are those within the family who certainly see themselves in some sort of positive way, even those who acknowledge the evil they have done. It would be expected that everyone not involved in the organization or who benefit from it would despise this kind of organized crime. Yet books, films, and celebrity involvement have caused a certain appeal to be placed on the mafia. Its tradition and appearance of a loyal family, along with the network of connections and media, have caused it to become romanticized. Yet, is there a glory to it? Those mob bosses are certainly not seen on lists of the greatest men of the age. Their influences on humanity are not seen as advancements. Their constant violence can almost be seen as animalistic. They come into power through what are deemed as wicked means. Machiavelli advises princes those may be called properly used, if of evil it is possible to speak well, that are applied at one blow and are necessary to one's security, and that are not persisted in afterwards unless they can be turned to the advantage of the subjects. He says if evil must be done, then let it be done swiftly at the beginning and not continuously. He who does otherwise, either from timidity or evil advice, is always compelled to keep the knife in his hand. Neither can he rely on his subjects, nor can they attach themselves to him, owing to their continued and repeated wrongs. Machiavelli predicts the atmosphere of the upper levels of power in the families. Everyone is always expecting to be killed or to kill. Leaders are temporary, and it is a rarity if they live to retire. Commonplace was the news that the underboss, consigliere, or capo had disposed of the boss and established one among them as the new Don. In chapter 17 is where the question of being feared and loved are found. As discussed before, the mafia uses fear as a weapon. These mob bosses learn that people will offer you their blood, property, life, and children, as is said above, when the need is far distant. But when it approaches, they turn against you. Machiavelli advises this. Nevertheless, a prince ought to inspire fear in such a way that if he does not win love, he avoids hatred, because he can endure very well being feared whilst he is not hated, which will always be as long as he abstains from the property of his citizens and subjects and from their women. This is also true of the mafia. The rise to power, though excessive, when done, in the family's eyes, correctly, is seen as admirable. At the very least, many of these heads of the families know to install enough fear to intimidate, yet not so much as to cause their men to hate them straight away. True that many did not last long, but there were certainly times when a Don had command over a hierarchy that did not 100% hate them. Interestingly, one of the reservations Machiavelli places on the prince is the property of the citizens, the prince's subjects, and their women. This is also seen in the mafia, where members were forbidden to steal from each other within the family, from disrespecting another member's mother, sister, or daughter, and they were also told that the family will take care of its members. In chapter 18, Machiavelli discusses how a prince should be an even balance of diplomacy and force, the first regarding the intellect of humanity, and the second regarding the animal instinct of man. Regarding the latter, Machiavelli writes that a man should adopt the mentality of two beasts, the lion and the fox, because the lion cannot defend himself against snares, and the fox cannot defend himself against wolves. In regards to the Mafia, we must remember the kinds of men these families wish to associate themselves with. Those of Sicilian roots, those with ruthless and cunning execution of tasks, and those with extreme loyalty to the family. This quote can draw a connection with this second type of person. Those who act like a fox in coming up with clean assassinations and recognize the traps and setups before it is too late, yet also are able to act like lions, pulling the trigger and not cowardly backing down from their duty. He also writes how a prince is not expected to keep his word if such observance may be turned against him, and when the reasons that caused him to pledge it exist no longer. If men were entirely good, this precept would not hold. But because they are bad and will not keep faith with you, you too are not bound to observe it with them. This is a lesson Dons seem to have taken to heart, especially those like Lucky, who were quick to assist in the setups that ended in their boss's murder. Machiavelli also discusses how a successful prince will allow everyone to see what you appear to be. Few really know what you are, and those few dare not oppose themselves to the opinion of the many, who have the majesty of the state to defend them. And in the actions of all men, and especially of princes, which is not prudent to challenge, one judges by the result. In the actions of the Mafia, if the result is more power, influence, or money for the family, then by all means, why wouldn't they continue the violence and mistrust they have for each other? In chapter 19, Machiavelli writes about how a prince should avoid those things which will make him hated or contemptible, and as often as he shall have had succeeded, he will have fulfilled his part, and he need not fear any danger in other reproaches. As discussed already, there is an attractiveness besides the power and money that give a more positive feel to the organization. Machiavelli also states that, whereas it was then more necessary to give satisfaction to the soldiers than to the people, it is now more necessary to all princes except the Turk and the Soldan to satisfy the people rather than the soldiers, because the people are the more powerful. This is very true for the Mafia, whose power comes solely from the people. If the people turn against them, they will lose their money, and in result, their power. In chapter 22, Machiavelli describes how crucial it is for a prince to have a confident relationship with his ministers. When, therefore, servants and princes towards servants are thus disposed, they can trust each other. But when it is otherwise, the end will always be disastrous for either one or the other. In regards to the Mafia, this disastrous end is usually death. Thank you so much for watching this video. Hope y'all found something interesting to take away from it. Have a nice day.